The Reformers and Their Stepchildren, Chapter 6, Wiedertaufer. The answer of a good conscience toward God, 1 Peter 3:21. Another one of the terms of reproach heard at the second front was Wiedertaufer, a word meaning Anabaptists, which in turn means rebaptizers. The name points to the stepchildren's practice of baptizing all who joined their congregations, even though these had been baptized already in the inclusive church, a practice which their enemies looked like rebaptism. The sources single out no man as the originator of 16th century rebaptism. In the words of Joseph Beck, from whom the idea of rebaptism issued, of this the sources say not a word. This requires an explanation. To rebaptize is to do an extremely radical thing. How radical we shall have occasion to see. How so radical a practice sprang up anonymously is passing strange. If it is assumed, as the vogue is, that Anabaptism was simply the product of the 16th century. But this silence as to who must be credited with the idea becomes wholly explicable once it is realized that what was known as Anabaptism in Reformation times was in no sense a new thing. Neither the name nor the practice was new, nor was the philosophy that lay behind this practice in any sense new. The Anabaptists did not initiate a new school of thought. They merely restated an ancient ideology, in the idiom of the 16th century to be sure, but ancient nevertheless. No one is credited with having invented the Anabaptism of the 16th century for the sufficient reason that no one did. Rebaptizing is as old as Constantinianism. There were Anabaptists called by that name in the 4th century. The codes of Theodosius already prescribed very severe penalty, capital punishment, for anyone who was convicted of having rebaptized. In fact, the first Anabaptist martyrs of Reformation times were put to death under the terms of these ancient codes. The very rigor practiced against Anabaptists requires our attention. To rebaptize was considered a capital crime. One gets the impression that this rigor was not born of solicitude for theological orthodoxy. The fact is that the codes were as severe as they were because much more was at stake than mere theological correctness. What was at stake was Constantinianism itself. We who have lived for some time now in the climate of societal compositism will find it hard to understand how a position and practice, which in our times do not so much as raise an eyebrow, should in former times have called down such wrath. To understand this rigor, one must in his mind reconstruct the world of Christian sacralism and the place which baptism, more specifically infant baptism, had come to occupy in it. In an earlier chapter, we saw that those who promoted the Constantinian change had seized upon the Christian agape, had made it over so that it might do for the new sacralism what the pagan sacramentum had done for the old. We saw that the, quote, Mass was the Christian agape after it had picked up the overtones of the old pagan sacramentum. The Christian supper had been changed into a sacralism-serving thing. Very similarly was the already existing institution of infant baptism laid hold of, subjected to a similarly motivated change, in order that it too might serve the cause of Christian sacralism. Men took the existing institution and made of it a christening, that is, a ritual whereby every child in the empire was taken and made a Christian of, before he had any voice in the matter. Since every child so christened was considered to be a Christian ever after, this was a highly useful institution, one that would see the sacralist ambition very far toward fulfillment. This fact, and this fact alone, will explain why protagonists of Christian sacralism have always been ferocious enemies of all who challenged christening. It was not so much a concern for the salvation of men's souls that dictated the baptism policy. It was rather a socio-political consideration. The protagonists of Christian sacralism were interested in christening because they were interested in the same thing in which Constantine had been interested, namely, a binder to give coherence to society. When Charlemagne, for example, prescribed the death penalty for any man who refused to submit to Christian baptism, he did this for political, not religious reasons. For the sacralist, the christening of everyone in the realm is a thing of utmost importance, for in that way a homogeneous society is made possible. We shall illustrate with an example from history that it was not in the first place a passion for theological correctness, nor even for the salvation of infants, that made the magistrates interested in christening, but rather its sacralism-promoting potential. From the many possible examples, we choose that of Margaret of Parma. When in 1567 she had reduced the city of Valenciennes, her first concern was to liquidate the heretical preachers, and her second concern was to see the restoration of christening. She had asserted that, assuming that the king should allow 2 religions, a thing I cannot believe he would do, then I would still refuse to be party to such a plan. Then I would rather let myself be torn into quarters. With the capitulation of the ill-fated city, she was in position to stamp out the idea of permitting more than one religion. And so she decreed, "Newly born infants shall upon birth be carried to the parish church in plain sight to be baptized, under pain of very heavy and rigorous correction for the parents, if they have been baptized in another way. Capital punishment is decreed for the parents, and for him who officiates at such other baptisms." Here we have a magistrate who is fanatically committed to the sacralist premise that all citizens must adhere to one and the same religion. She would rather die in a violent death than be party to societal compositism. Her rigorous policy in regard to the baptism of infants finds its explanation in this, her commitment to the sacralist formula. So great a stake did the proponents of Constantinianism have in the institution known as christening, that they frequently resorted to Zwangtaufe, that is, baptism performed against the wishes of the persons involved. Actually, when Charlemagne decreed that any who refuse baptism shall be put to death, he was already practicing Zwangtaufe. The agents of the fallen church practiced forced baptisms in outright fashion very commonly. We have already referred to the fact that the missionary to the Flemish countryside, Amandus by name, met with so much opposition that he had to pick himself out of the Schelde repeatedly. I guess that's a river or something. It has been suggested that this treatment was a case of Zwangtaufe for Zwangtaufe. So great a stake did the sacralists have in christening that a great many Jews were in medieval times baptized against their wishes. At times in medieval Portugal and Spain, as many as 80% of the Jews had been subjected to the indignity of Zwangtaufe. As we shall point out in its proper place, instances of Zwangtaufe occurred in Reformation times and right up to relatively recent times. It is the concomitant of Constantinianism. Although infant baptism had occurred more or less sporadically in pre-Constantinian times, quote, christening dates from the inauguration of, quote, Christian sacralism. For the fashioners of the new order, infant baptism was too valuable to leave unexploited. In a matter of decades, it had become almost universal practice. It was inevitable that those who were not kindly disposed toward the Constantinian change should launch an assault upon baptism in its new form. The Donatists were the original Anabaptists. Constantine and his collaborators within the church, convinced as they were that there can be no peace in the marketplace unless there is concord at the shrine, had begun to bring about the baptism of the rank and file. Thereupon, the Donatists began to say that baptism administered by an everybody-embracing church is not Christian baptism, but a sorry surrogate. They therefore felt called upon to administer real baptism to those who joined their fellowship, even if these had already been subjected to the lustration of the fallen church. This was by their opponents derisively referred to as rebaptism. In their eyes, rebaptism was frightful procedure. If one's baptism is a sign of one's citizenship in Christendom, then a second baptism is a badge of disloyalty to that Christendom. And so legislation was drawn up with a view to the liquidation of those who obstructed the development of Christendom. There is a whole chapter in the ancient codes with the healing Ne sanctum baptisma iteretur, that baptism is not to be repeated. And in these codes, the death penalty is prescribed for the original Anabaptists. Mentioned in the same context is also the infraction of conducting a conventicle, or as we have called it, a Wickel predict, or I've been saying Winkle service. it too was to be punished by death. These two infractions, that of the Wiedertäufer and that of the Winkler, are in this ancient legislation clubbed together. This will not surprise us once we have grasped the real issue. Both are assaults upon the idea of a church, including all in a given locality. Both have as their objective the recovery of a church based on personal faith. Both are assaults upon Corpus Christianum, carried out in the interest of Corpus Christi. Donatism was successfully suppressed, but that does not mean that the vision of Donatism was eliminated. It proved to be impossible to stamp out the conviction that lay at the heart of the Donatist rebellion. We continued to hear the overtones of Donatism all through medieval times. There were always those for whom the church was a body of believing men and women, rather than the christened masses. Occasionally, even the word Donatist was heard, up to modern times. In the year of our Lord 1050, for example, action was taken against certain heretics, with whom one point of heresy was that they overthrow infant baptism. Moreover, it is said in the same breath that in doing so, they introduce ancient heresy. A century later, we find the Pope Lucius III assailing heretics who, touching baptism, do not hesitate to think or teach otherwise than the Holy Church of Rome teaches and practices. Men who were critical of the latitudinarianism of the everybody-embracing church were sure to criticize its baptism. In the light of the New Testament, its christening procedures laid it open wide to criticism. Even among heretics who tried to operate within the church's baptism frequently was under attack. We see this in the case of one Brother Michael who was burned at Florence in 1389. Although he wore the cloth of the prevailing church, his heart was the heart of a heretic. He seems to have had around him a contingent of disciples, members of his ecclesia. We owe the story to one of these. In the course of his trial, such remarks as the following were thrown at him. "So the church has remained among you. Oh, you who say that we are not baptized nor true Christians. Thou art among heathen folk." Manifestly, Brother Michael was quite close to the restitutionist vision, even though he continued outward connection with the church. Nor was he far removed from Anabaptism, for anyone who challenges the validity of the church's christening needs to go but one step farther to be a full-fledged rebaptizer. The logic of the situation requires that step. One cannot remain content with a baptism which he considers invalid. He must rebaptize if he takes baptism at all seriously. It is well known that Pierre de Brie, Bruys, who lived in the 12th century, attacked the christening customs of the prevailing church. He taught that no one should be baptized until he had reached the age of discretion. He assailed christening not only, but also practiced rebaptism. The word, of course, he did not use. No Anabaptist has ever been at peace with that word. But the Petrobrusians, as Pierre's followers were called, declared, "We wait until the proper time has come, after a man is ready to know his God and believe in him. We do not, as they accuse us, rebaptize him who may be said never to have been baptized before." This was restitutionism, plain and simple. What was unique in this eruption of restitutionism was that it was attempted inside the everybody-embracing church. Evidently, de Brie was faced with the same dilemma in which we saw Martin Luther involved, that of the church as a society of believers versus the church as a society embracing all in a given locality. Like Luther, he apparently toyed with the possibility of creating a believers' church without abandoning the inclusive church, an impossible combination of mutually exclusive concepts. The consistent thing to do was to leave the everybody-embracing church and reinstitute a church of believers. Not ecclesiola in ecclesia, but restitutionism was the effective solution of the problem posed by Christian sacralism. That solution was tried, often enough in medieval times, and consistently too. We read, for example, of a large contingent of heretics burned at Trier in 1231. They had their own ecclesiastical setup, even a bishop or general supervisor. They had all the telltale features of restitutionism. They were well at home in the New Testament, which they possessed in the vernacular. They did not believe in the body of the Lord, that is, they were opposed to transubstantiation. They said that a priest living in sin was incompetent to officiate at the sacrament. They believed that any man or woman can administer the sacrament, out of any bowl or chalice and at any place. They said that extreme unction and prayer for the dead are superfluous. They minimized the sacrament of orders. And attached to this list of items of heresy, all of them well-known features of anti-Constantinianism, we find that these heretics also repeat baptism. Not only did the complex of ideas that lie behind the practice of rebaptizing come to expression throughout medieval times and as parts of the restitutionist vision, but this feature was sometimes considered the central point in it. Peter the Venerable, a trusted son of the Empire Church, declared that the first point made by the heretic is that children below the age of intelligence cannot be saved by baptism. The argument here is exactly that which we shall hear from the lips of the Anabaptists of Reformation times. The sole difference is that, whereas the Anabaptists said it in German, it is here couched in medieval Latin. We have it on good authority that the Waldensians, those heirs of the ancient Anabaptists and forerunners of the new, practiced rebaptism. A 14th century manuscript preserved at Strasbourg informs us that the Waldensians have themselves rebaptized by their own clergy. That this was indeed the custom among the Waldensians was known to Luther, who said of them, "These brethren hold to the idea that every man must believe for himself, and on the basis of his own faith receive baptism, and that otherwise baptism or the sacrament is useless. So far they believe and speak correctly, but when they proceed then to baptize little children nevertheless, that is to make sport of holy baptism, it cannot help them that children are baptized on their future faith. For faith must be on hand before and in baptism, otherwise the child is not delivered from the devil and from sin. Therefore need would require that the Waldensians would have themselves rebaptized, just as they baptize those who come to them from us." Here we have rebaptism going hand in hand with the practice of infant baptism. What the Waldensians had against christening was not the infancy of the recipient, but the Constantinian overtones of the ritual. Therefore they rebaptized converts from the prevailing church and practiced infant baptism in the case of their own little ones. In another place, Luther reported similarly about the Anabaptism of the Waldensians. It was in 1522 that he wrote of them, "They baptize little ones and rebaptize those who come to them from us." Here again is proof that early anti-paedobaptism was not based on a distinguishing view as to the accessibility of child life to the grace of God, but was based rather on an aversion to christening, that is, to baptism with sacralist overtones. This early Anabaptism was not so much a matter of anti-paedobaptism as a matter of anti-Constantinianism. It is significant that, in some instances at least, the Anabaptism of the 16th century did not in its earliest manifestations assail infant baptism as such, but rather the christening of the fallen church. We read that in the earliest days of Anabaptism in the Wassenberg area, infant baptism was not as such repudiated. What was repudiated was the christening ritual. In connection with one of the earliest evidences of Anabaptist stirrings in these parts we read, "A child was baptized in a dwelling by Hendrik von Honingen in Goddard Reinhardt's house. It will become 1 year old this summer. Diederik Jurgens baptized a child with his own hands." Here we encounter a clean break with the Empire Church, a gathering in a private home where the sacrament of baptism was administered by an unordained man. This is restitutionism of the first water. Yet it goes hand in hand with the baptism of a child less than a year old. Among the Bohemian Brethren, it was likewise customary to rebaptize converts from, quote, Christendom. But here also the point was not anti-paedobaptism, but anti-Constantinianism. For the Brethren did not practice infant baptism in the case of children born to believing parents, that is, to parents who were members of the Church of the Brethren, of the Unitas Fratrum. We see then that rebaptism did not necessarily go hand in hand with a rejection of paedobaptism. It is said that Michael Sattler, one of the first to lose his life for the cause of restitutionism, was at the first rather kindly disposed toward infant baptism. This less than vehement attitude toward it was manifested at various other sectors of the Second Front. What was opposed, we may therefore say, was not so much paedobaptism as such, but christening. The outright rejection of infant baptism came when it became apparent that the Reformation was headed in a neo-Constantinian direction. Not until the Reformers began to embrace the old institution of christening did the Anabaptists, by way of reaction, make a clean sweep of the board. Prior to that point, there had been considerable give and take on both sides. As long as the Reformers were still riding the fence, as long as they tried to live with their dilemma, they were, to put it mildly, far from being fanatic proponents of infant baptism. They became such. And their development in that direction dates from the moment when those who came to be dealt with as stepchildren had made it plain that for them there was no dilemma. It was then that the Reformers became emphatic supporters of the other horn of the dilemma. And with that the contest was on, with each side throwing in all that it had. This sequence is most clearly traceable in the case of Huldrych Zwingli, on whose doorstep infant Anabaptism was born. Early in his career as a reformer, he was, to put it mildly, too mildly, rather lukewarm toward the baptism of little ones. He confessed in those early days, "Nothing grieves me more than that at the present I have to baptize children, for I know it ought not to be done." This was plain talk. Here was a man who was deeply aware that the renewal of the church called for a radical break with christening. He knew that this was pretty central in the reform, so central that it weighed more heavily on him than any other matter. We cannot help asking why Zwingli, if he was so sure that christening was wrong, did not let it be known that he was desisting. To answer this question, one must remember that the civil rulers of the city were sacralists. They saw in sacrament the cement that bound society together. They would therefore be loath to part with infant baptism. This meant that if Zwingli were to act on his insight, he would immediately come under their displeasure. This could imply the drying up of the spring from which he drank, the loss of his stipend. That it was this consideration that caused Zwingli to draw back is quite apparent from the words with which this utterance of his ends. "If, however, I were to terminate the practice, then I fear that I would lose my prebend." On another occasion, Zwingli wrote, "I leave baptism untouched. I call it neither right nor wrong. If we were to baptize as Christ instituted it, then we would not baptize any person until he has reached the years of discretion, for I find it nowhere written that infant baptism is to be practiced." This again is clear enough. Although Zwingli begins by saying that he wishes to refrain from cutting the knot, he certainly gives his opinion and expresses his conviction. It is that christening has no foundation in Scripture, and that the right baptism is believer's baptism. Again, we are driven to ask why he then hesitated, why he drew back from the course which he had felt had biblical warrant, and why he continued in the way that lacked such warrant. To find the answer to this question, one must remember that the former course was frightfully radical. To propose to terminate christening in a sacral society, which had for a millennium been held together by it, was to propose a pretty radical thing. It was very similar to reading some men out of society. That is why Zwingli added, "However, one must practice infant baptism so as not to offend our fellow men." At still another point, Zwingli spoke his mind on this matter to his associates Hans Hager and Rudi Fessenwasser. To them he confessed, "If we were to baptize in accord with the command of Christ, then we would not baptize anyone until he has reached the age of discretion." This again is altogether plain. One is led to ask once more why this reformer then dragged his feet, why he allowed himself to be party to the perpetuation of a practice which he saw things, as he saw things, lacked biblical warrant. He again answers our question. It is again the matter of offense. He adds specifically, "But on account of the possibility of offense, I omit preaching this. It is better not to preach it until the world is ready to take it." It is quite apparent that what restrained Zwingli from introducing believers' baptism was the consideration that such a baptism would tend to divide society, the one thing that men of sacralist conviction cannot allow. Anything that results in composite society is for the sacralist an intolerable evil. That it was this that kept Zwingli back is altogether apparent. Baptism, said he, is a visible sign wherewith a man makes himself responsible to God and makes this apparent to his neighbor with the outward sign, without faction making, otherwise it brings into being a sect, and not one faith. Zwingli, like so many of his generation, was blissfully unaware that the Church of Christ is by definition a sect. They were mortally afraid of everything that so much as smacked of rotary or faction-making, forgetting that the Church of Christ, as set forth in the New Testament, is by definition a faction. In any given situation, a party, a segment of society, never the totality. Later on, when the second front had been opened and Zwingli had turned his guns upon his erstwhile companions, now known as Anabaptists, he was, of course, embarrassed by his earlier utterances in regard to the baptism of infants. He seems not to have kept his anti-christening ideas out of his pulpit utterances quite as much as he had planned. The Anabaptist leaders, at any rate, were not slow to accuse him of doing an about-face. And he, in turn, tried to whittle down what he had said. Hubmaier, one of the captains in the second front, scolded him. "You used to hold to the same ideas, wrote and preached them from the pulpit openly. Many hundreds of people have heard it from your mouth. But now all who say this of you are called liars. Yes, you say boldly that no such ideas have ever entered your mind, and you go beyond that, things of which I will hold my tongue just now." Zwingli, understandably irked, replied, "After it had been rashly accepted that the sign testifies to the faith, then men had to assail infant baptism. For how could baptism testify to the faith in the case of little children, seeing they cannot believe? This error had misled also me some years ago, and made me think it were better not to baptize little ones until they had grown up." He had saved the day for himself, but it had cost him the concept of believers' baptism. He was now defending unbelievers' baptism, that is, a baptism that is proper even where faith is presumably not present. In passing, it may be useful to recall that Luther went to the same extreme in his attempt to get away from the Anabaptist doctrine that baptism is in place only where faith is presumably present. With his customary rashness, he cried out, "How can baptism be more grievously reviled and disgraced than when we say that baptism given to an unbelieving man is not good and genuine baptism? What, baptism rendered ineffective because I do not believe? What more blasphemous and offensive doctrine could the devil himself invent and preach? And yet the Anabaptists and the Rottengeister are full up to their ears with this teaching. I put forth the following. Here is a Jew that accepts baptism, as happens often enough, but does not believe. Would you then say that this was not real baptism because he does not believe? That would be to think as a fool thinks not only, but to blaspheme and disgrace God moreover." If Zwingli emerges from his wrangle about infant baptism as something less than a paragon of courage, let it be recalled how frightful was the only other road open to him. Here was the council of the city cautioning him, when the news had reached them that Zwingli was going roughshod over age-old institutions of Christendom, saying, "It becomes no one, and least of all a preacher, to call ancestral deliverances and ordinances superfluous, foolish, or vain. By so doing, the Holy Church, the ancient fathers, the councils, the pope, the cardinals, and bishops, etc., will be made to look ridiculous, will be disdained and eliminated." Lest one think that it was a concern for theological correctness that motivated the council, it should be noted that they added in the same breath, "And then there will spring up disobedience toward the magistracy, disunity, heresy, and the weakening and diminution of the Christian faith." To go squarely against this philosophy, so typically sacralist, was no small thing. It would be frightfully costly to go against it. How costly the Anabaptists were soon to learn. On January 17, 1525, the council at Zurich notified the public that there was to be no tampering with the sacralism-serving institution of christening. All parents were in the same edict ordered to have their children baptized within a week, upon pain of banishment. This precipitated the flight at once of all the Anabaptist leaders, Rubli, Brotli, Hotzer, and Kasselberg. Zwingli would have been among them if he had not swung to the right. A little later in 1529, the Diet at Speyer decreed that every Anabaptist or rebaptized person of either sex is to be put to death by fire or by sword or by some other means.